Okay, we're recording. So thanks, Peter, for having this conversation. I wanted, like we were saying before we started, I think your sort of entrance into mountaineering is interesting for people. And, you just summited Aconcagua successively. So I want to talk about that trajectory and what it was like for you and how training played a role in that. So I looked back, we started working together in the summer of 2001. And at that point, correct me if I'm wrong, but you hadn't really climbed much, correct?
No, I think I mentioned to you, I didn't even have a backpack. Like I had
Right,
never,
no backpack.
never been backpacking or anything. Like it was, yeah.
And you just 1.5 years later, you just successfully summited Aconcagua. So
Yeah.
that's a pretty huge accomplishment in a short period of time when you really, I hope you've also taken the time to like sit back and reflect on that because it's a pretty quick trajectory to one of the highest mountains in the world. So when you had though a pretty solid background in running when we started working together.
I ran. So even before, I never done anything competitive. Like
Okay.
I wasn't, but I was someone who ran just for fitness.
Yep.
Like, okay, so I would go for a 3 mile run or a 5 mile run, or maybe I think the longest distance I'd ever run before we started training was maybe 8 miles. Never done
Awesome.
anything. Yeah, never done anything never done anything too intense, and also never really done anything with like competitively. I wasn't, I didn't grow up in going, doing like competitive running or anything. But yes, I enjoyed running, and it was something I would just do to stay fit.
And then
Yeah.
what made you curious or interested in mountaineering? What started that for you?
It was an interesting story. I was in Zion National Park, and I just so happened to be with a friend, and we decided on the spur of it to use a guide to take us through some of the paths on Zion.
Cool.
And throughout the trip, he was this guide, and he was relatively young. I think he was early 20s. He mentioned that he had climbed a year. And throughout the trip, he just kept talking about this experience of climbing Mount Rainier, and and after I got back, it sort of put a bug in my head. I was like, I was older than him. I'm 40, right? So, and he mentioned that he had done this trip, and I started looking into it. I was like, okay, why couldn't I do something like that, right?
Yeah.
I think that was what triggered in my mind meeting this guide, and I was sort of at a point in my life where I had more free time. My career is sort of like stabilized, and I'm not working 60, 70-hour weeks. So I thought, okay, maybe it's something I could look into and something I could get into too. Why not, right? And so I looked up companies that could do Rainier, and that's how I came across your contact through Mountain Madness. So that was and they listed in there as like, if you've never had done anything like this before, maybe take a look at getting a coach first before signing up. And so I think that's when we spoke, and that's how that was triggered it. It was just a curiosity to say, maybe I'm someone who could do something like that.
Yeah.
And looking into it. Yeah.
I love that random meeting with this guide in Zion, which was
Totally
a
random.
the moment decision, has led to what, obviously I don't know what the rest of your life is like, but to me, it feels like climbing is now a pretty big part of your life. Like you set a lot of goals related to it throughout the year and obviously devote a lot of time to training and preparing.
Yeah, it was a random encounter that led me to climb the Aconcagua. It's funny, I could trace that. Yeah.
Yeah, you should circle back to him and just thank him or blame him, whatever the case might
be. I should. Yeah.
But you started, so before Rainier, though, you started by climbing mountains closer to where you live in California. So you started with Whitney.
That's right. Yeah. So we started working in July, right? And so the season. So if we were to do Whitney, if we were to have tried for Rainier, it would have been the 2022 season.
Yeah.
To give me some time to prepare and all that. And I think what we started looking at near, mountains that were closer in the Sierras, and because I'm in California, I'm in Northern California. And so the question was, were there, climbs that we could do? And so I was like, yeah, Whitney was something I'd always wanted to do, never got around to doing it. And there was a very interesting route. It's the Mountaineers route that you can take. And so I think that was when we said, okay, let's set a goal for that. And we started in July, and that was the end of September, early October. Around that time was the first. And so Whitney was the first thing we said, okay, let's do that first. And then I think you also encouraged me to try Baker instead of Rainier first. And so then we established, okay, Mount Baker is going to be our goal, and that'll be a 2022 goal, right? And then we started with Whitney. So yeah.
And now you've climbed Whitney how many times?
I've done Whitney now 3 times, twice in summer and once in winter.
Yeah. What do you, so looking back, and I want to ask you this question relative to Aconcagua too, because we'll talk about that in a minute, but looking back on that first Whitney climb, is there anything that you really were surprised by or that was unexpected to you? How did that first climb go?
It was really challenging. So and again, the Mountaineers route, different from the regular route. I think a lot of people take the hiking route, where it's, I think 10, 11 miles, and you do it in a day. I think it's each route. Again, I might be totally butchering that. The Mountaineers route is, you do it you're gaining 6,000 feet but you split it up in 2 days, and each day you gain 3,000 feet in the first day and across like maybe 2.5 miles. And then the next day, similar short mileage, large elevation gain. And it's often you camp, you spend a night at 11,000 feet, so to speak. So it was challenging. Like, I remember the second day, from 11 to 14, first experience at altitude, like really, we started around 8,000, right? And you go to 11 to 14. So from 11 to 14, it was difficult. I started first experiences with slight altitude effects, right? Headaches, mild headaches, like slight nausea. And then it's impossible to sleep, right? Like just difficulty sleeping. So those are all, and it was, at the time, I thought it was one of the most difficult things, especially the second day when we were going up the, in the winter, it's a couloir. I'm not sure what they call it in the summer.
Yeah.
It was just this, this just field of gully, this gully that was, it was really challenging. We had to move quickly because there's a danger of like rocks coming down and stuff. And it was just, at the time, I considered it the most difficult. I remember reaching the notch where then we have to rope up and do a sort of a slightly like rock climbing sort of section.
Yep.
And I remember reaching that point and thought I was done, right? And I told the guy, I was sort of like telling the guy, I'm not sure if I can go any further. But then he was like, look, it's just 400 feet more to the summit. So we were up, we finished the rest of the climb. But again, at the time, it was, most challenging thing I'd done.
And I think there's so many directions we could take this conversation, because the guide saw in you probably something that you, having never been in a situation that was that physically demanding or challenging, you didn't know that you had what it took to get there and back safely. And I think that's often an overlooked benefit of guides, that they get to know you and what you're capable of and can push you through those situations where you might not see that you're able to do it. So I love that he or she helped you. And then I would imagine that and many other things helped you prepare for Aconcagua. So were there moments, or what from your early climbs on Whitney, on Baker, did you really draw upon as you were climbing Aconcagua this past month?
Definitely the trek into base camp. I think being comfortable with the altitude, the acclimatization hikes from Plaza at Confluencia, which is our first camp on the trek before we reached. It's just all of that trekking that we needed to do. I felt you feel comfortable doing it because you've done something like Whitney. I've done Whitney a few times, and so getting from that like 6,000 to 8,000 to 14,000 feet. Where base camp is around 14.5, something give or take, right? Where Plaza de Mules is you felt comfortable. Like I was used to the altitude. By this time, I'd done Whitney, 3 times. Used to my body had sort of gotten used to being at getting up from sea level to 8 to 14,000
Right.
feet. So,
Right.
yeah, it was definitely something that prepared me for that initial part of the climb.
And what was your experience like on Aconcagua? So overall, how did it go?
It was challenging. It was funny because every time I do something, it's like, oh, that's going to be that's the most difficult thing I've done. But this was definitely that made the whole Whitney experience sort of very. It was a much longer expedition, right? So
Sure.
obviously the duration, and it's you get a sense that you're very far from home. I guess that's also that's new,
Yeah.
when you're in
Yeah.
the Sierras or something, you're a drive away from getting back. For me anyway, it's like a long drive from home, right? But here you're on a mountain, you're multiple days from anywhere, from camp, and so you have sort of like you're not going anywhere else. You just have to be in it, and you have to just keep
Yes.
just doing it one day at a time. I think that was the part of you keep thinking, oh man, there's like 14 more days or like 10 more days of climbing, and but you just have to process it like, okay, I just have to make it through the next day.
Absolutely.
You sort of, you're thinking about it, and you go to bed at night, and not thinking like, wow, I have so much more to go. You just have to think about, okay, you just need to make it through the next carry day or the next climbing day, and to the next camp. You're just not thinking about the volume of climbing left to do. And that was something new. You have to, I mean, again, like I've only been on 3-day climbs before, so it wasn't, and that's, and in the sort of like the comfort, I'm going to say the comfort of the continental United States.
Yeah.
So
yes. I think
yeah.
I think it's great that you pointed that out, because for many people, who maybe aspire to climb the 7 summits, Aconcagua is usually the first taste that someone has of an expedition style climb, where, like you said, you're at base camp for multiple days, you're doing rotations, you're far from home, you realize that, if I need emergency medical attention, it's not as easy as a walk or a 20-minute drive to a hospital. And that all plays into the mental side of high elevation mountaineering, where, there's a point, and I don't know if you felt this on Aconcagua, but I believe there's an elevation where it doesn't matter how fit you are anymore, because your body is deteriorating, your fitness is declining rapidly, and you've got to rely on your own mental strength and fortitude to get through it. And all of those little things, like for some people, just being on an expedition is really stressful. And, it's hard to unplug from what's going on at home. It's hard to just be in the moment. It's hard to accept that they're sort of stuck on this mountain. There's, no easy escape hatch. And so I think being ready for that, and also taking baby steps to get there, makes a big difference in someone's mental fitness when they're on a mountain. So it's good that you bring that up, I think. I'm curious if there were, so you also did a lot of running, right? You ran as you were, in the past year and a half, you've done a couple of 50 milers. Am I remembering that correctly?
I did 2 30Ks, and I trained for, and we attempted 2 50Ks. So I didn't finish the 50Ks, but definitely we put in a large volume of work towards those 2 50Ks. And then I did, and just so before we started training, the trail running was something I loved, and that was something that I really enjoyed doing, on top of just like, running on flat surfaces and stuff, and just going for hikes. So incorporating that was relatively easy, and incorporating that, but then the distances that we did were something new. Yep. Like I remember when you told me that, I would go for like hour or just an hour and a half. But when we started training, it was like, okay, you need to go for a 2.5 hour run or something, which was just a vast, huge leap from anything that I'd done. And I didn't know I was able to do something like that.
Right. Right.
Large volume of, and I think that was important, right? The volume of the
Absolutely.
running and having those distances was, and it was good. I think the training for, your aerobic fitness, it wasn't an issue like during, I felt like that helped immensely during the climb.
Yeah, it absolutely did. And I think the fact that you have easy access to trail running is great. The fact that you love it also, like I think there were times when I had to say, like, Peter, you don't like don't need to go for a run today. You could take a rest. But that really, so going back to mountaineering being an endurance activity, all of that time you spent on the trails really helped you be prepared from a cardiovascular perspective and from an endurance perspective for Aconcagua. As a coach, one of the best things I can hear is when someone comes home, they're like, yeah, like my strength was great. I had enough endurance, enough fuel to keep going. It was the weather maybe or something that became a challenge, but those other things that are within our control as climbers, right? I've always said how you show up to the mountain, your fitness, your mental preparedness, having your gear dial, those are all things that are within your control. And so I love hearing from athletes that I work with that, they felt like all those things were lined up and ready to go on the mountain and weren't what became the biggest challenges. For you, looking back on Aconcagua, what would you say your biggest challenge was?
It was getting used to the altitude. So acclimatization. I think I was trying not to use Diamox for the whole trip.
Yep.
And then I think once we did our first carry to Camp 1, started. So I was fine up right until base camp. Then after that first carry, I started really being impacted by the altitude. So, and that was quite debilitating, so that was when headaches started. And then I started the Diamox from that point on and just taking like half doses. And that helped a lot. So that eliminated the headaches, and it wasn't and I still had some nausea at some points of the climb, but it was much more manageable. It was just the exhaustion then was the issue, right? Like you're just tired from your carry days or moving up to a higher altitude. I felt much less impacted by the altitude. So that was one of the biggest things that I faced on the mountain. So I wasn't, and definitely getting comfortable with work, working with such an elevated heart rate. I think that was also something that
we talked about that.
First really experienced it on this mountain, right? Where I always wasn't used to being, okay, your heart rate is, your baseline is maybe 70 from mid 50s. Now it's shifted to 70s, mid 70s. And then as you move up, and then once you're exerting yourself, like just constantly being in that higher zone, like higher zones, and from just from doing not any activity.
Right, from walking to the toilet tent.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So those were all new experiences, and I hadn't really had that level of experience before going to the mountain. So,
and I think again, it's why it's good to take these climbs in baby steps, right? And take a little elevation, then a little more elevation. And I will be curious to hear from you the next time you climb a mountain in that elevation range, because my experience has been that it's still hard. It still sucks to go from sea level to 20,000+ feet. But I feel like there is some memory that happens in your body that recalls, like, oh yeah, this is when I have no oxygen and I still have to perform and work hard. And it feels like it gets easier over time. I think there's a point then probably with age where it starts to decline and it doesn't get easier anymore. But I think it's good it's good that you noted that, and it's good that you had, diamox there. So you had some tools and you had a plan for what to do if you did start to really feel like the elevation was just, too much. And if you're nauseous, for sure, you want to do something about it. So was there anything that surprised you so elevation was something that was challenging. Is there anything else that you wish you'd known before you went?
So I think a lot of team members ended up using porters on the trip. So at the start, I was, when I first got there, I thought, okay, I'm going to be able to do the whole thing, carrying, my full pack plus the group gear. And very quickly, once we did those, and the guides were really great. I have to say, they said, do your first. So they didn't, and there was an option you could option in porters depending on how you felt basically at any of the 3 camps, even from base camp. They said, see how you feel, and then we'll make a decision. We can help you with that decision. So we did the first carry to camp 1, and that was when I started feeling the impact of the altitude, and really, I was, I don't know, I felt a lot. It was, it wasn't that I was challenging my strength, but it was just the elevated heart rate, just being exhausted from doing such minor activities. That's when I made the decision. Okay, let's go with the porter, just so that I can get more experience up the mountain, and not and be able to make the times to each of the different camps, and stick with the group. All these other activities. So it was much easier decision to make, and I saw much more experienced climbers were also like, hey, you know what? It's not down much bigger mountains that we're using porter. Like, I'm using a porter. It's fine. It wasn't. That wasn't like a reflection on me, or like, oh, you're not less of a. I was like, look, we used mules to bring our stuff in. It wasn't like we were, climbing, Right. So, it's not. It's okay. It wasn't like, oh, you're less of a blah 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 because you did this or the other thing. So those are just like things I preconceived ideas of what I should do when I'm on the mountain. Then when you're there, you're like, okay, if I need to take medication, that's okay. Or I don't, it doesn't make me, if I took Diamox, someone else didn't take Diamox, doesn't mean, you're less of a climber. Same thing. If you had to use a porter, else didn't use a porter, it doesn't mean your experience was less than. No, it was, you did what you had to do at the time. And we have so many other things that we've used, to assist us up there. And it's okay. Like, I think, anyway. So those are just things that preconceived ideas, and then being flexible with yourself, right? Not saying, okay, not so dogmatic and going, okay, I need to impose further suffering on myself up on this mountain by doing everything myself and not, resisting any assistance whatsoever. Like you said, it was a year and a half, and I'm doing this mountain, and so I need to give myself time to get comfortable. And you can see other climbers that have been doing this for a long time, that have the experience, and they're building their own camps and doing their own, doing everything themselves, right? And so, and you can say, okay, that takes time to get to that, and many years of experience. So
yes, it does. And I love that you pointed out the necessity of being flexible.
Just checking the connection, Lisa, if you can still hear me.
Oh, I can. Yeah, all good. Can you not hear me? Can you hear me?